My husband's new girlfriend showed up at my door, grinning. "We are moving into this house, pack your bags," she gloated. I grinned even more, as my lawyer was standing behind her. Before we continue, I would like to ask you to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, so you will receive all our new videos of stories of empowered women. Let's go back to the beginning of the whole story. I never thought I'd see that smug face at my doorstep on a Tuesday morning. There I was, sipping my coffee, still in my pajamas with my hair pulled back in a messy bun, when the doorbell rang. It wasn't even 9 a.m. yet. Little did I know that opening that door would turn my peaceful morning into complete chaos. Talk about being blindsided. You know that feeling when something's off, but you can't quite put your finger on it? That's exactly what hit me when I saw her standing there. Emma, my ex-husband Robert's new girlfriend, dressed like she was attending a business meeting, with perfectly styled hair and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The moment her gaze met mine, I felt a chill run down my spine. "Carol, right?" "I'm Emma," she said, extending her hand as if we were meeting for a friendly brunch. I didn't take it. There was something calculated about her presence, something that made my stomach twist into knots. Then, she dropped the bomb that would send my world spinning. "I'm here about the house. Your house, actually. Well, I should say our house now." I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost because she let out this little laugh that made my blood boil. Can you believe the nerve? Standing at my doorstep, claiming my home. I gripped the doorframe so hard my knuckles turned white. For a split second, I considered slamming the door in her face, but curiosity got the better of me. What game was Robert playing now? "Excuse me?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. Emma's smile widened as she shifted her designer purse from one arm to the other. "I know this must come as a shock," she said, though her tone suggested she was enjoying every second of my confusion. But Robert assured me everything was handled legally. We're planning to move in this weekend. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The audacity, the absolute audacity of them both. After everything Robert had put me through during our divorce, this was a new low even for him. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I'd dealt with Robert's schemes before, and I wasn't about to let this one throw me. "You'd better come in," I said, stepping aside. Not because I wanted to welcome her, but because this wasn't a conversation I wanted my neighbors overhearing. As Emma stepped into my home, I noticed how her eyes darted around, already mentally redecorating. She ran her finger along my grandmother's antique sideboard as if checking for dust, and I had to bite my tongue to stop myself from saying something I'd regret. Emma settled herself on my couch without waiting for an invitation, crossing her legs and placing her handbag beside her like she owned the place. "Robert mentioned you might be difficult about this," she said with faux sympathy. "But really, it's all perfectly legal. He's been very generous, offering you 2 weeks to pack your things and find somewhere new." I almost laughed out loud. Was this for real? 2 weeks? Generous? I'd lived in this house for over a decade. It took everything in me not to lose my cool right then and there. Instead, I sat down across from her, my hands clasped tightly in my lap to stop them from shaking. Not from fear, but from pure, unadulterated anger. "I think," I said slowly, carefully choosing my words, "that you and Robert have made a serious miscalculation." Something in my tone must have caught her off guard because her smug expression faltered just slightly. Good. It was time to wipe that self-satisfied smile off her face once and for all. This house had been my sanctuary, my safe place after everything fell apart with Robert, and I wasn't going to let anyone take it from me, especially not his new arm candy. I watched with rising indignation as Emma reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a folder with such theatrical flair you'd think she was about to reveal the winning lottery ticket. "I brought the paperwork," she announced, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I thought you might want to see it for yourself." She slid a document across my coffee table, with perfectly manicured fingers. The paper looked official enough at first glance, with stamps and signatures that made my stomach drop. Was this actually happening? I picked it up with trembling hands, scanning the text while trying to maintain my composure. It was a deed transfer, with Robert's signature prominently displayed at the bottom, alongside Emma's. The date on it was just last week. My eyes darted over the legal jargon, desperately searching for something, anything that would expose this as the fraud I knew it had to be. As you can see, Emma continued, leaning back on my sofa like she was already hosting her first dinner party here. Everything's completely above board. Robert explained that there was always an understanding between you two that this property would revert to him after the divorce. She had the audacity to look sympathetic, her head tilted slightly as if she were delivering bad news to a child. He said you just needed time to adjust to the separation, but that you'd always known this. Day would come. I felt my blood boiling, literally burning through my veins as I stared at this document. What a tangled web of lies Robert had spun. There was never any understanding about the house. In fact, quite the opposite. The house had been a major point of contention during our divorce, with Robert fighting tooth and nail to get his hands on it. He'd failed then, so what made him think he could succeed now? I glanced up at Emma, who was watching me with the smug satisfaction of someone who believed they'd already won. "This must be quite a shock," she said, filling my silence with her honeyed poison. "Robert told me you might react emotionally. That's why I wanted to come in person. Woman to woman, you know?" Emma crossed her legs, her expensive shoe dangling casually from her foot. "I understand you have a lot of memories here, but sometimes we all need to move forward." She gestured vaguely around the living room. "We've already picked out new furniture that will work so much better in this space." The sheer audacity of it all nearly knocked the wind out of me. This woman I'd never met before today was sitting in my living room, describing how she planned to redecorate my home. I clutched the document tighter, noticing details that hadn't registered at first glance. The notary stamp looked legitimate, but something about the wording seemed off. I've read enough legal documents in my life to know when something doesn't quite add up, and this definitely didn't. "It's a shame Robert couldn't come himself," I said, finally finding my voice. "Too busy planning your new life together in my house?" I couldn't keep the bitterness from seeping into my words. Emma's expression didn't falter, but I caught a brief flash of something in her eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps? She twirled a strand of perfect blonde hair around her finger, a nervous habit that betrayed her confidence might not be as solid as she wanted me to believe. "He's actually meeting with the movers today," she replied smoothly. "We're thinking of starting with the master bedroom this weekend." She smiled again, that practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Robert mentioned you've been using the guest room anyway, so we thought it would be less disruptive for you while you pack." The casual way she discussed my private life made my skin crawl. What else had Robert told her about me? What other lies had he fed this poor, manipulated woman? I forced myself to take several deep breaths, fighting the urge to crumple the paper in my fist and throw it in her perfectly made-up face. Instead, I carefully placed it back on the table and pushed it toward her. "This document," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "is worth about as much as the paper it's printed on." I leaned forward, meeting her gaze directly. "And I think deep down, Emma, you know that. Robert has always been good at making people believe what he wants them to believe. It seems you're his latest victim." Her composure cracked just slightly, a tightening around her eyes, a subtle clench of her jaw. For a moment, we just stared at each other, two women caught in the web of one manipulative man. But I had one advantage Emma didn't. I knew exactly who Robert was and what he was capable of. I'd spent years untangling myself from his lies. She was still wrapped up in his deception, believing she was about to claim a prize that had never been his to give in the first place. And as I looked at her now, With her confident facade beginning to show hairline fractures, I felt an unexpected twinge of pity. Emma's face contorted into a mixture of confusion and indignation. "What do you mean this document isn't worth anything? It's legally binding." She reached for the paper, clutching it like a lifeline. Little did she know, I had an ace up my sleeve. I hadn't planned on company that morning, but sometimes fate has perfect timing. Just as Emma was launching into another self-righteous speech, the sound of footsteps coming down my hallway made her pause mid-sentence. "Carol, is everything all right?" I heard raised voices. Diane, my attorney and thankfully my longtime friend, appeared in the doorway of my living room. I couldn't help but smile at the perfect timing. Diane had stopped by to drop off some paperwork before heading to court. The look on Emma's face was priceless, her confident facade crumbling as she realized she wasn't the only one with legal backup in this situation. Sometimes the universe really does have your back when you need it most. "Everything's fine, Diane. This is Emma, Robert's new girlfriend. She was just showing me some interesting paperwork." I gestured toward the document on the table with a calmness I didn't feel but was determined to project. Apparently, Robert has sold her on the idea that this house belongs to him. Diane's eyebrows shot up as she set down her briefcase and extended her hand to a visibly flustered Emma, who shook it mechanically, her confident demeanor now replaced with uncertainty. "Diane Walker, Carol's attorney." She introduced herself with the professional coolness I'd always admired. Without asking for permission, Diane picked up the document from the table and began examining it, her experienced eyes catching details, much faster than mine had. I watched Emma's face as Diane scanned the paperwork, noting how the other woman's gaze darted nervously around the room, no longer making direct eye contact with either of us. It was amazing how quickly her smugness had evaporated once she realized she wasn't the only one with legal representation in the room. "This is interesting," Diane said after a moment, her tone measured, but with an undercurrent of something that told me she'd found exactly what I suspected, a flaw. "Emma, are you aware that this notary stamp belongs to someone whose license was suspended 3 months ago?" Diane looked up from the paper, her expression neutral, but her eyes sharp as daggers. "And this clause here," she pointed to a paragraph, halfway down the page, "directly contradicts established property law in this state. I'm curious, did you have your own attorney review this before you came here today?" The color drained from Emma's face so quickly I was momentarily concerned. She might faint on my living room rug. Robert assured me everything was legitimate," she stammered, reaching for the document as if seeing it again might somehow change what Diane had just pointed out. "He said his lawyer handled everything." Her voice had lost its earlier confidence, now tinged with the first notes of doubt and fear. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered how she'd walked into my home planning to take it from me, and my sympathy evaporated like morning dew under a harsh sun. "I'm sure he did," I said, unable to keep a hint of bitterness from my voice. Robert has always been very convincing when it comes to getting what he wants. I exchanged a knowing look with Diane, who had represented me during my divorce and knew firsthand the manipulative tactics my ex-husband was capable of. But convincing doesn't make something true, and it certainly doesn't make it legal. Emma's eyes darted between Diane and me, clearly trying to process this sudden shift in power dynamic that had left her on the defensive. Diane returned to the document, circling several sections with her pen. "Just from a preliminary review, I can identify at least 3 major legal issues with this deed transfer." Her professional tone somehow made the situation even more devastating for Emma, who was now perched on the edge of my sofa, no longer looking like she owned the place. "For starters, there's no record of a proper title search. The supposed transfer violates the terms of Carol's divorce decree and—" Diane flipped the paper over, examining the back. "There's no evidence of the required tax stamps. Whoever prepared this document either doesn't understand real estate law or deliberately created a fraudulent instrument." Emma's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and what I recognized as the dawning realization that she'd been duped. "But Robert spent so much money on this," she whispered. more to herself than to us. He said it was all taken care of, that we just needed your signature as a formality. Her voice trailed off as she seemed to be mentally retracing conversations with Robert, reassessing them in light of this new information. I could almost see the gears turning in her head as she began to question everything he had told her. I leaned forward, feeling an unexpected wave of compassion despite everything. "Emma, how long have you known Robert?" I asked gently. She looked up, startled by my sudden shift in tone. 8 months, she replied, her voice small. "We met at his company's holiday party." I nodded, remembering how charming Robert could be when he wanted something, how persuasive and confident he always appeared, especially to those who didn't know his true nature. "And in those 8 months, has he ever given you reason to doubt his word? To question whether he's being completely honest with you?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications that were only just beginning to take shape in Emma's mind. Emma's face was a canvas of conflicting emotions, denial battling with the first painful strokes of realization. "Robert wouldn't lie to me," she insisted, but her voice lacked conviction. "He said this house was part of his assets before your marriage, that you unfairly claimed it during the divorce." She looked down at her hands, which were now trembling, slightly. "He told me you were bitter about the breakup and refusing to honor your agreements." I couldn't help but let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Is that what he told you?" The familiar ache of Robert's betrayal resurfaced, not for me this time, but for this woman sitting across from me. "Let me guess. He also said I was emotionally unstable? Probably mentioned how unreasonable I was during the divorce proceedings?" Emma's eyes widened slightly, confirming my suspicions. "Those are his greatest hits, you know. He played them for his colleagues, his friends, even his family when our marriage fell apart." Diane placed a comforting hand on my shoulder before addressing Emma. "I represented Carol throughout her divorce from Robert, so I'm intimately familiar with the details." Her professional tone carried the weight of authority that made Emma lean forward attentively. "Robert attempted to claim ownership of this house during the proceedings, presenting documentation that was later proven to be altered. The judge was not impressed, to put it mildly." Diane reached into her briefcase and pulled out a folder. "In fact, I still have copies of the court transcripts where Robert was reprimanded for attempting to mislead the court." Emma's perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the flush of embarrassment creeping up her neck. "He said it was just a misunderstanding during the divorce," she mumbled, her confident demeanor from earlier completely evaporated. "That his lawyer made a clerical error that made him look bad." She glanced around my living room with new eyes, no longer assessing what furniture would be replaced, but seeing it as what it truly was, someone else's home that she had been convinced was rightfully hers to claim. "Robert has always excelled at revisionist history," I said, trying to keep the bitterness from my voice. "He creates narratives where he's always the victim, never the villain." I watched as Emma's fingers nervously twisted the expensive ring on her right hand. Not an engagement ring, I noticed, despite how serious Robert had apparently made their relationship out to be. "Let me guess, Emma. Did Robert tell you he needed money to secure the deed? That legal fees and transfer costs had to be paid up front?" The color drained from her face so completely that I knew I'd hit the nail on the head. "How did you—" she began, then stopped herself, closing her eyes briefly as though gathering strength. $15,000, she whispered, the words clearly painful to speak aloud. "I took it from my savings. He said it was an investment in our future, that once we had the house, we could refinance and I'd get it back with interest." A single tear escaped, leaving a thin track of mascara down her cheek. Diane and I exchanged knowing glances. This wasn't the first time we'd heard of Robert's financial manipulations. "Emma," Diane said gently, "based on what I'm seeing here and what you're telling us, it appears Robert has deliberately misled you about his legal right to this property." She gestured to the fraudulent document still lying on the coffee table. This pattern matches his behavior during the divorce proceedings, creating seemingly legitimate paperwork, collecting money for supposed legal fees, and promising outcomes he has no ability to deliver. Emma's composure finally cracked completely. "He's been staying at my place for the past 3 months," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Said his rental was being renovated, and it made sense to move in together since we'd be getting this house soon anyway." She looked up, her eyes swimming with tears and dawning horror. "Last week he lost his job, claimed it was office politics, and jealous colleagues, and said not to worry because we'd have this house to fall back on. That's when he showed me the paperwork, and said we needed to act quickly before you got wind of it." The pieces were falling into place, creating a picture I recognized all too well. Robert, backed into a corner financially, had found a trusting woman with resources he could exploit. He'd weaved an elaborate fiction to extract money from her, using my house as bait. It was the same pattern he'd followed in our marriage, charming and attentive until he needed something, then constructing whatever narrative necessary to get it. "Emma," I said softly, "how much else has he taken from you?" Her silence was answer. Enough. But after a moment she began to speak, words tumbling out as though a dam had broken. "My credit card. He's an authorized user. For emergencies," he said. "There were always emergencies." She wiped at her eyes, smudging her makeup further. "Car repairs, business opportunities that needed immediate investment, a deposit on a vacation, property that never materialized." With each admission, her voice grew stronger, anger gradually replacing embarrassment. "I thought I was helping build our future together. I thought," her voice cracked again, "I thought he loved me." The raw pain in her voice struck a chord deep within me. I remembered that pain, that humiliating realization that love had been performative, a means to an end. Robert hadn't changed. He'd simply found a new mark. As I looked at Emma now, mascara streaked and illusions shattered, I didn't see the smug homestealer who had arrived on my doorstep. I saw another victim of Robert's elaborate betrayals, someone else who had trusted and been thoroughly deceived by a man who saw relationships as transactions and other people as resources to be exploited. "Emma," I said, taking a deep breath, "there's something fundamental you need to understand about this house." I looked around at the walls that had sheltered me through both happiness and heartbreak. Robert never had any legal claim to this property, not during our marriage, not after our divorce, not ever. I watched her expression shift from confusion to disbelief, her perfectly shaped eyebrows drawing together. "But he said," she began, then stopped herself, seemingly realizing that what Robert said held less and less weight with each passing minute. Diane nodded encouragingly at me, and I continued with the truth that Robert had always tried to obscure. "This house belonged to my grandmother," I explained, my voice softening with the memory. "She raised me here after my parents died when I was 11. I spent my teenage years in this house, graduated high school while living here, and eventually inherited it when she passed away 5 years before Robert and I even met." The familiar grief of losing my grandmother mingled with anger at how Robert had tried to claim something so personally significant to me. Emma looked around with new eyes, perhaps seeing for the first time the personal touches that made this house uniquely mine. The bookshelf my grandfather had built, the slightly worn spot on the banister where my hand had rested thousands of times, the small chips in the kitchen doorframe marking my height throughout childhood. "Robert told me it was a property he purchased before your marriage," she said quietly, her voice hollow with the realization of yet another lie. "Robert never contributed a single dollar to this house," I continued, my voice stronger now. "Not to the mortgage, which was paid off by my grandmother, not to the property taxes, not even to the renovations we did during our marriage." I gestured toward the kitchen I had remodeled myself after the divorce, another act of reclaiming my space. "He always had excuses, business investments, temporary cash flow issues, promises of future contributions that never materialized." Diane pulled another document from her briefcase, this one older and clearly official. "This is the deed transfer from Eleanor Williams, Carol's grandmother, dated 15 years ago," she explained, showing it to Emma. "As you can see, it predates Carol's marriage to Robert by several years. During the divorce proceedings, Robert tried to claim he had contributed sweat equity through home improvements, but was unable to provide any evidence to support these claims." Emma's shoulders slumped as she studied the document, then looked up at me with eyes that held a mixture of embarrassment and anger. The way he talked about this house, the detailed plans for renovations, which rooms we'd use for what. He spoke like someone who knew every inch of this place and had the right to decide its future. She shook her head slowly, the reality of Robert's deception clearly sinking in deeper with each revelation. "Robert lived here for 7 years during our marriage," I acknowledged. "He knows the house well, the leaky faucet in the guest bathroom, the creaky third step on the staircase, the way the afternoon light fills the reading nook." My throat tightened unexpectedly at these memories. "But knowing a place doesn't make it yours. This house has only ever legally belonged to 2 people, my grandmother and me." Emma's gaze dropped to her hands, which were clenched tightly in her lap. "So everything, all of it, was a lie," she whispered, more to herself than to us. "The money I gave him for legal fees, the plans we made, the future he promised." Her voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. Robert had constructed an elaborate fantasy and sold it to her completely, extracting thousands of dollars in the process. I felt a surprising surge of compassion for this woman who had arrived at my door as an adversary, but now sat before me as another casualty of Robert's manipulations. "Robert has always been skilled at creating realities that don't exist," I said gently. "During our marriage, there were business partnerships that never materialized, promotions that were always just around the corner, and investments that would supposedly secure our future but somehow always required my savings, never his." Emma sat frozen on my couch, her face a portrait of dawning horror as the full scope of Robert's deception became clear to her. The confident woman who had strutted into my home just an hour ago was gone, replaced by someone who looked utterly lost. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What have I done?" She pressed her perfectly manicured hands against her face, smudging her makeup further. But she clearly didn't care anymore about keeping up appearances. "It's not what you've done," I said gently, surprising myself with the compassion in my voice. "It's what was done to you." I recognized that look of devastating realization. I'd seen it in my own mirror 3 years ago, when I finally understood who Robert truly was. There's something uniquely painful about discovering that the person you trusted has been systematically lying to you, using your feelings as leverage to get what they want. Emma reached for her purse with trembling hands and pulled out her phone. She scrolled through it frantically, stopping to stare at what appeared to be banking apps. "He's drained my savings account," she said, her voice hollow with disbelief. "There was over $30,000 in there yesterday." She looked up at me, her eyes wide with panic. "My credit cards, they're all maxed out. He must have gone on a spree this morning after I left to come here." A sob escaped her as the financial reality of her situation hit her all at once. Diane and I exchanged concerned glances. This was worse than we'd imagined. Robert hadn't just lied about the house. He'd apparently been planning a complete financial decimation. "Emma," Diane said with professional calm, though I could tell she was disturbed, "you need to call your bank immediately and report fraud. Then contact your credit card companies." She reached into her briefcase and handed Emma a business card. "And you should consider filing a police report. What Robert has done could constitute criminal fraud." As Emma made the calls, her voice shifting from shock to anger with each conversation, I made a pot of strong coffee in the kitchen. This wasn't how I'd planned to spend my Tuesday, comforting my ex-husband's girlfriend, but life has a way of throwing unexpected curves. When I returned with 3 mugs, Emma was finishing her call with the fraud department of her bank, her face tight with controlled rage. They said they'll investigate, but the transfers were made from authorized devices, using my correct passwords, she explained, accepting the coffee with a grateful nod. Since I'd given Robert access, they're not sure if they can classify it as fraudulent activity. She took a shaky sip, then set the mug down hard enough that coffee sloshed over the rim. 6 months of my life. 6 months of believing every word he said, trusting him with my finances, my home, my heart. Her voice broke on the last word, and for a moment I thought she might break down completely. Instead, Emma straightened her shoulders, a steely resolve replacing her earlier distress. He told me you were vindictive, unstable, that you'd try to poison me against him if we ever met. A bitter laugh escaped her. I actually felt sorry for him, having to deal with such a difficult ex-wife. She looked at me directly, her eyes clearer now despite the smeared mascara. I'm sorry for coming here like this, for the things I said. I was so sure I was fighting for our future, for what was rightfully ours. Robert has always been convincing, I acknowledged, remembering how long it had taken me to see through his facade. He presents everything with such confidence that questioning him feels like you're the unreasonable one. I paused, realizing that in some strange way, this awful morning had given me something I hadn't expected. Validation that it wasn't just me who had fallen for Robert's manipulations, that his behavior wasn't something I had caused or deserved. Emma nodded in understanding, a silent acknowledgement of our shared experience. How did you do it? She asked after a moment. How did you finally break free from him? There was an earnestness in her question that tugged at my heart. She wasn't just making conversation. She was looking for a path forward for herself, a way out of the rubble Robert had created of her life. One day at a time, I answered honestly, with help from people who believed me when I finally started telling the truth about what was happening behind closed doors. I glanced at Diane, who had been my rock through the darkest days. It wasn't easy, and there were times I almost went back. Times I almost believed his promises that things would be different. But eventually I realized that the life I could build without him, even with all its uncertainties, was infinitely better than the carefully constructed lies we'd been living. Emma's fingers trembled as she scrolled through her contacts and landed on Robert's name. The determination in her eyes was unmistakable, the kind that comes only when betrayal transforms hurt into fury. She glanced at me, a silent question in her gaze. I nodded encouragingly. This was her moment of reckoning, and as much as I wanted to protect her from the pain that was coming, I knew it was necessary. I'm putting this on speaker, she announced, her voice steadier than I expected. I want witnesses. The phone rang 3 times before Robert's smooth, confident voice filled my living room, the same voice that had once whispered promises in my ear, the same voice that had apparently been feeding Emma the same hollow words. Hey, babe, how's it going with the house? Is Carol being reasonable? The casual arrogance in his tone made my skin crawl. Emma's knuckles whitened around her phone as she took a deep breath. You lied to me, Robert. About everything. Each word was deliberate, sharp as a knife. I'm sitting here with Carol and her attorney, looking at the real property records. The house was never yours. It belonged to Carol's grandmother before Carol inherited it. The silence on the other end was deafening, stretching for several seconds before Robert attempted to recover. Emma, sweetheart, there's clearly been a misunderstanding. Carol's manipulating you. His voice oozed false concern, a tactic I recognized all too well. Emma didn't let him finish. Stop. Just stop. Her voice cracked with emotion. I checked my accounts, Robert. All of them. You've taken everything. The facade of control she'd been maintaining began to crumble. $30,000 from my savings, maxed out credit cards. Was that your plan all along? String me along with promises about this house while you emptied my accounts? Robert's tone shifted instantly from concerned to defensive. That's our money, Emma, for our future. I told you I had investment opportunities lined up. There is no our money. Emma shouted, tears streaming down her face now. There is no our future. There's just you, taking advantage of me like you did with Carol. She was shaking visibly now, years of financial discipline wiped out in a single morning by a man who had never intended to build anything with her. You've ruined me, she continued, her voice breaking. I trusted you with everything, my home, my savings, my heart, and it was all just a game to you, wasn't it? The raw pain in her voice stirred memories of my own confrontations with Robert, the gradual, devastating realization that love had been nothing but leverage. Robert's response turned cold, calculating. You're being hysterical. We can discuss this privately when you've calmed down. The dismissive tone was familiar. Robert always retreated to condescension when confronted with his lies. There's nothing to discuss, Emma replied, finding new strength in her anger. It's over, Robert. Don't come back to my apartment. I'm calling the police, my bank, everyone. They'll know exactly what you did. She paused. Her next words weighted with finality. I see you now, the real you, and I'm done. She ended the call before Robert could respond, then looked up at me with eyes that held both devastation and a flicker of something new, liberation. In that moment, despite everything that had happened, I felt an unexpected kinship with this woman who had arrived as my adversary, but now sat beside me as someone who understood exactly what I'd been through. It took 3 months for the dust to settle after Emma's confrontation with Robert. 3 months of legal notices, police reports, and the sweet satisfaction of watching Robert's carefully constructed house of cards collapse around him. The first domino fell when Emma filed fraud charges. Robert had been so confident in his manipulation that he'd left a trail of evidence. Texts promising repayment of borrowed funds, emails detailing his fictitious claims to my house, and witnesses who'd heard him boast about his scheme. Diane helped Emma build an airtight case, and I found myself in the unexpected position of being her star witness. I never thought I'd be grateful to see the inside of a courtroom again, I told Diane as we waited for Robert's hearing. But there's something poetic about it, isn't there? Robert showed up in a suit that couldn't hide how much weight he'd lost, his once confident stride reduced to a defeated shuffle. When the judge ordered him to repay every penny he'd taken from Emma plus damages, his face crumpled. But the real blow came when the judge mentioned potential criminal charges for attempted property fraud. The defendant's pattern of behavior shows a disturbing disregard for legal ownership and a willingness to fabricate documents, the judge stated, peering over her glasses at a pale-faced Robert. This court takes a very dim view of such actions. Robert's carefully cultivated image as a successful businessman shattered overnight. Former colleagues distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with someone facing fraud charges. His new employer, the job he'd supposedly lost, was just another lie, fired him when the court case made local news. The man who had spent years building a reputation on smoke and mirrors now had nowhere to hide. Meanwhile, I thrived. My small interior design business, born from the ashes of my marriage, had gained traction. Clients appreciated my authenticity and attention to detail. Each successful project felt like reclaiming another piece of my confidence that Robert had tried to destroy. One evening, as I sat on my porch swing, the one my grandfather had built and Robert had always hated, my phone buzzed with a text. From Emma. He's officially homeless, staying at a motel off Highway 16. Thought you should know. I didn't feel the vindictive pleasure I'd expected. Instead, I felt light, unburdened. Robert had lost everything: his reputation, financial stability, and the women he'd tried to manipulate, while I had built something real and lasting. My house stood solid around me. My business was growing. And most importantly, I was free from the web of lies that had once entangled me. Good to know, I texted back. But I don't need to keep track of him anymore. And I meant it. My victory wasn't in Robert's downfall. It was in the life I'd created despite him, a life that was authentically mine. As the sun set over my grandmother's garden, I realized I'd finally stopped giving Robert space in my thoughts. That was the greatest victory of all. 6 months after that fateful morning, my doorbell rang again. This time, I wasn't in pajamas, but dressed for a client meeting, portfolio in hand, and confidence in my stride. When I opened the door to find Emma standing there, I almost didn't recognize her. Gone was the perfectly styled businesswoman with the designer purse. This Emma wore minimal makeup, simple clothes, and carried herself with a quieter, more authentic presence. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said, her voice lacking the artificial sweetness of our first meeting. "I just wanted to stop by before I leave town." I invited her in, curious rather than apprehensive this time. We settled in my kitchen, neutral territory, with cups of coffee between us. Emma stared into her mug for a long moment before meeting my eyes. "I owe you an apology," she began. A real one, not just the rushed words I said that day. Her fingers fidgeted with her cup, but her gaze remained steady. I was so blindly convinced that Robert was telling me the truth that I never questioned. How my actions would affect you. I walked into your home ready to take it from you, full of self-righteousness and entitlement. The raw honesty in her voice was striking. This wasn't the performative remorse Robert had perfected, all dramatic. Sighs and promises without substance. Emma's apology carried the weight of genuine self-reflection. "I've spent months trying to understand how I let myself become that person," she continued. "Someone who would believe the worst about a stranger based on a man's words. Someone who could justify taking another woman's home." She shook her head, visibly disappointed in her former self. "The truth is, I wanted to believe I was special, that Robert chose me because I was different from you, better somehow. It was easier than admitting I was just the next target." I felt an unexpected surge of empathy. Hadn't I done the same during my marriage? Convinced myself that Robert's ex-girlfriends were the problem, that our relationship was different, special? "I'm moving to Portland," Emma explained. "Starting over with what little savings I've managed to rebuild. The court ordered restitution, but..." She shrugged, the gesture conveying what we both knew. Getting blood from a stone was easier than getting money from Robert. "Before I left, I needed you to know how sorry I am. Not just for that morning, but for every moment I spent believing his lies about you. You didn't deserve any of it." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, wrapped package. "It's not much, but I saw it and thought of you." Inside was a delicate stained glass ornament. A house, with warm light seeming to glow from within. "Thank you," I said, surprised by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. "And Emma, I hope Portland is everything you need it to be." As she left, I realized something healing had happened for both of us. Two women, once positioned as adversaries by a manipulative man, recognizing our shared humanity instead. Robert had failed to make us enemies. In that failure lay perhaps our greatest victory. The 2 years following Emma's departure were transformative. My boutique interior design business, once a side hustle born from necessity, blossomed into something I could never have imagined during my marriage. What started as simple redesign projects for friends expanded into full-scale renovations for upscale clients, my signature style, practical elegance with vintage touches, becoming recognizable around town. Spaces by Carol even caught the attention of a regional lifestyle magazine, which featured my renovation of an historic downtown apartment. The day the issue hit newsstands, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. I hired my first assistant that week, then a junior designer the month after. By the end of the year, I had a small team working from a converted Victorian downtown, a space that reflected exactly who I was, no compromises. "You know what I love about this place?" my friend Megan said during the office warming party, gesturing around at the exposed brick walls and carefully curated vintage finds that decorated the space. "It's completely, authentically you. There's not a trace of Robert's influence anywhere." Her observation stopped me in my tracks. She was right. For years during my marriage, my design choices had been subtly shaped by Robert's criticisms. His dismissal of family heirlooms as old junk, his insistence on modern, impersonal pieces that showcased status rather than comfort. I'd compromised my vision so many times that I'd almost forgotten what it was, but no more. Every decision I made now, from the clients I accepted to the spaces I created, came from a place of authentic passion. I specialized in helping people, particularly women emerging from difficult life transitions, create homes that truly reflected their spirits. There was something healing about helping others reclaim their spaces when I had fought so hard for mine. Financial success followed the creative fulfillment. For the first time in my life, I had substantial savings, investments that Diane had helped me select, and the freedom to choose projects based on interest rather than necessity. I renovated my grandmother's garden, creating the sanctuary she had always dreamed of, but never had the resources to complete. Occasionally, news of Robert filtered back to me through mutual acquaintances. He'd been moving between temporary jobs, borrowing money from increasingly reluctant friends, always with a new scheme that was supposedly going to restore his former glory. Each time I felt a momentary twinge, not of sympathy, but recognition of how easily that could have remained my life had I stayed. When he finally called me himself, voice slurred and desperate at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, asking if he could crash at the house for just a few days until things turned around, I didn't feel angry or vindicated. I felt nothing at all. "No, Robert," I said simply. "That's not possible. After everything we went through together? You're really that cold?" His attempt at emotional manipulation felt like a script I'd heard too many times to be affected by. This isn't about being cold. It's about boundaries. My life is moving forward, and you're not part of it anymore. As I hung up, I realized the truth in my words. My business was thriving. My home was truly mine, and my future stretched before me, bright with possibilities that had nothing to do with the man who had once tried to diminish me. That growth, that independence, it was the greatest revenge I could have ever imagined. The irony wasn't lost on me when, 3 years to the day after Emma had shown up at my door, I found Robert waiting beside my car outside my design studio. He'd aged a decade in those years, hair thinning, expensive suits replaced by worn khakis, and a jacket that had seen better days. For a moment, I didn't recognize him. When I did, I felt nothing but a distant, clinical observation. How strange to think this man once held such power over my emotions. "Carol," he said, pushing himself off the wall he'd been leaning against. "You look great." His smile was the same, practiced charm that never quite reached his eyes. Once that smile had made my heart flutter. Now I noticed only the calculation behind it. "What do you want, Robert?" I kept my keys in my hand, maintaining the distance between us. The confidence in my voice wasn't forced. It was the natural result of years spent rebuilding myself. "Can't a man just say hello to his ex-wife?" He attempted a casual laugh that fell flat in the chilly evening air. When I didn't respond, his facade cracked slightly. "Look, I've been doing some thinking, some reflection, about us, about how things ended. Things didn't end, Robert. You systematically lied and manipulated until I finally saw through it. Then you tried the same tactics with Emma, and that fell apart too." I wasn't angry anymore, just stating facts. He winced, then quickly regrouped. "That's what I want to talk about, actually. I've changed, really changed this time." The earnest look in his eyes was one I remembered well. The look that had once convinced me to give second, third, fourth chances. "I'm getting my life back together, starting a new business venture with some serious potential investors. But I need..." Of course. There was always a need with Robert. I cut him off. "Let me guess. You need a loan, or a place to stay, or maybe A character reference for whatever scheme you're running now. The pity I felt surprised me. Not for his circumstances, but for how predictable he remained. It's not like that, he protested, though his eyes darted away. I thought maybe we could talk about a fresh start. The house has plenty of room and... Stop. My voice was quiet but firm. The answer is no, Robert. To whatever you're asking, I've moved on. My life is good. Better than I ever imagined it could be when we were together. You always were stubborn, he said, a hint of the old condescension creeping into his tone. Still holding grudges after all this time. That's your problem, Carol. You never could let things go. I laughed then, a genuine laugh that seemed to startle him. That's where you're wrong. I have let go, of resentment, of anger, of you. That's not a grudge, Robert. That's growth. I unlocked my car, placing my portfolio on the passenger seat before turning back to him. I wish you well. I really do. But my life doesn't have room for your chaos anymore. As I drove away, I caught a glimpse of him in my rearview mirror, still, standing there, looking smaller somehow. There was a time when such an encounter would have left me shaken for days, questioning my decisions, wondering if I'd been too harsh. Now, I felt only peace. That evening, as I sat in my grandmother's garden watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, I realized that true closure doesn't come from confrontation or even forgiveness. It comes from building a life so full and authentic that the past no longer has power over your present. Robert had been reduced to what he truly was, a chapter in my story, not the whole book. My phone buzzed with a message from my newest client, excited about the renovation, plans we'd discussed earlier. Life was calling me forward, and this time, nothing was holding me back.